At 18, Evelyn Carter is sold by her uncle like a commodity. No explanation, no choice, no future. She's taken to a stranger's farm in the middle of a harsh Wyoming winter, where thick snow obscures all escape routes. The man doesn't need a wife. He needs a tool, and Evelyn knows that. But what she doesn't expect is that, in that cold house, among the distant children and the man withdrawn from the grief of losing his wife, she'll have to choose between survival and truly living. Please like, comment with the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. And follow to the end, because the ending won't be anything you expect. The wagon hit a rut in the frozen road, and Evelyn caught herself on the sideboard before she could pitch forward into the driver's back. He didn't look around. He hadn't looked at her once since they'd left Harwick, not when she'd climbed up with her single trunk, not when she'd asked twice how far the Ward Ranch sat from town. He just clicked his tongue at the horses and kept his eyes on the white road ahead, and Evelyn understood then that she was cargo, and cargo didn't require conversation. She pulled her coat tighter. It was the good coat, the one her Aunt Meredith had pressed on her that morning with both hands and wet eyes, smoothing the collar like she could stitch protection into the wool. "You'll be warm enough in that," Meredith had said, which wasn't the same as "you'll be all right," and they both knew it. Evelyn had hugged her aunt for a long time, longer than made sense. Neither of them said what they were actually thinking, which was that this might be the last time. Her uncle, Gerald Carter, had not come out of the house to see her off. That was 3 hours ago. Now the wagon moved through a landscape that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Treeless hills folding into each other under 6 inches of snow, the sky the color of old pewter pressing down low on everything. The occasional dark shape of a fence line emerging from the white and then vanishing again. Wyoming in January was not a place that made room for sentiment. It just was what it was, indifferent and enormous, and Evelyn sat in it with her trunk and her coat and the feeling of a door closing behind her that she had not been the one to shut. She was 18 years old. She thought about that number sometimes like she was checking to make sure it was still true. 18. Old enough to be handed over, apparently. Old enough to have the law stand aside and let it happen. Gerald had explained it to her over supper 3 weeks ago, in the same flat voice he used for everything. Livestock prices, weather predictions, her future. Caleb Ward was a widower. 3 children. A working ranch outside a town called Delmore, 40 miles southeast of nowhere. His wife had died 14 months ago, and the place was suffering for it, and Gerald had a debt to clear, and Evelyn was 18, which made the arithmetic tidy. She had not cried. She'd wanted to, badly, the way you want to breathe when something is sitting on your chest. But crying in front of Gerald Carter was something she'd learned not to do around the age of 9, when her parents had died of a fever within a week of each other, and he'd taken her in with the manner of a man accepting an inconvenient shipment. He wasn't cruel, exactly. He was simply a person who had decided long ago that emotions were an expense he couldn't afford, and he applied that philosophy to everyone around him, including the orphan niece who'd slept in his spare room for 9 years and cooked his meals and mended his shirts and made herself as small and useful as possible in the hope that usefulness would eventually be enough. It wasn't. The wagon dropped down into a shallow valley, and she saw it, the Ward Ranch materializing out of the gray afternoon like something half-remembered from a bad dream. A main house, low and wide, with a covered porch running the length of the front. A barn, bigger than the house, dark red paint faded to a dull rust. Outbuildings clustered behind. A smokehouse, a chicken coop, what looked like a root cellar. 3 horses in the paddock, standing with their backs to the wind. Smoke from the chimney, thin and reluctant looking. It was not welcoming. It was not unwelcoming. It was simply there, waiting, as everything on the frontier simply waited. The driver pulled up in front of the house and set the brake. And that was the full extent of his involvement. Evelyn climbed down herself and stood in the snow while he unloaded her trunk and set it in the dirt beside her, and then climbed back up and turned the wagon around without a word. She watched him go. She stood there alone in the yard for a moment that felt much longer than it was. The front door opened. Caleb Ward was not what she'd expected, though she wasn't entirely sure what she'd expected. 40, maybe 42, with the kind of face that had been weathered into a permanent expression of mild resistance. Dark eyes under a heavy brow, jaw set like he was braced for something unpleasant. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from actual labor and not from trying to look broad. and he wore no coat despite the cold, just a flannel shirt and suspenders, which she would come to understand was simply how he was. He felt the cold the way other men felt mild inconvenience. He looked at her trunk first, then at her. "You're the Carter girl," he said. "Evelyn," she said. "Carter, yes." He nodded once, like she'd confirmed something mildly relevant. "You eat? On the road?" "No." "Come in, then." That was the whole of it. No handshake, no welcome, no acknowledgement that the situation was in any way unusual or that a young woman had just arrived at his door, having been essentially traded for a debt settlement. He simply turned and went back inside, leaving the door open behind him, and Evelyn picked up one end of her trunk and dragged it up the porch steps and through the door because there was nothing else to do. The interior of the house hit her in layers. Warmth first, from the iron stove in the corner, almost aggressively warm after the cold of the wagon. Then the smell. Wood smoke and something boiled, coffee from this morning or maybe yesterday. Then the disorder, not filth exactly, but the particular disarray of a household running without enough hands. A pile of mending on the table that had not been mended. Boots by the door that needed oil. A window with a cracked lower pane stuffed with a rag. 3 children arranged around the room like they'd been placed there for a portrait, and then forgotten. A girl of about 6 sitting on a stool by the stove, clutching a rag doll. A boy of perhaps 9 or 10 standing near the far wall with his arms crossed. And an older boy, 15 or 16, leaning against the doorframe to what she assumed was the kitchen, watching her with an expression she recognized from her years with Gerald, careful assessment of a new variable. The little girl looked up at her. Her eyes were her father's dark shade, but in her small face they read differently. Uncertain, hopeful in spite of herself. "Are you the lady?" she asked. "I'm Evelyn." She crouched down to the girl's level, which made her back protest from the wagon ride. "What's your name?" "Rosie." A pause. "Rosie Ward." "That's a good name." Rosie seemed to consider this seriously. "Mama liked it," she said. The middle boy said nothing. He was still watching from the wall with his arms crossed, brown hair, gap between his front teeth, eyes that were somewhere between suspicious and simply tired. Evelyn would learn his name was Eli, and that he was 10, and that his primary mode of operation was waiting to see which way things were going to go before committing to any particular response. The oldest said, "You're not what I figured." She looked at him. "What did you figure?" "Someone older." He didn't say it like an insult, just a statement of fact. "Or bigger." "I'm sorry to disappoint." "I didn't say I was disappointed." He pushed off the doorframe and went into the kitchen. She heard the sound of something being moved, a pot, a lid. Caleb had sat down at the table and was looking at a piece of paper, a bill of some kind. She'd see enough of those in the coming weeks to recognize the angle of a man reading bad numbers. He didn't look up. "Michael'll show you your room," he said to the paper. "Supper in an hour." "Mr. Ward," she said. He looked up. Just barely. "I'd like to know what's expected of me, here. I'd rather know now than—" She stopped. She'd been about to say "then find out wrong," which was something Meredith said when she meant "then make a mistake that costs me." "I'd like to know my responsibilities." He looked at her for a moment with those flat, dark eyes, and she couldn't read anything in them. Not annoyance, not welcome, not the faint contempt she'd been bracing for. "House," he said. "Meals, washing, mending. Rosie needs looking after mornings while Eli and Micah are in the barn. Chickens. Root cellar inventory needs doing. I don't know what we've got left." He paused. "Can you bake?" "Yes." "Micah says the sourdough starter's dead. I don't know if that's true. I'll look at it." He nodded and looked back at his paper. Micah appeared in the doorway again. She hadn't heard him come back. He jerked his chin toward the hallway without making eye contact. She picked up her trunk. The room he showed her to was at the back of the house, off the kitchen, small enough that the trunk took up a third of the floor space. A cot. A blanket that had been washed, but not recently. A window looking out at the barn. A hook on the wall, and nothing else. Micah stood in the doorway while she set the trunk down and looked around. "This was the hired man's room," he said. "We haven't had a hired man in 8 months. It's fine. The window doesn't stay up unless you prop it." "All right." He was quiet for a moment. She started to unpack her trunk. There wasn't much, a change of clothes, a few personal items, a small book of her mother's she'd held onto through everything. "She's not going to warm up to you," Micah said. Evelyn paused. "Who?" "Rosie. I mean, she'll seem like she does because she's little and she doesn't know better yet. But she's going to keep hoping Mama comes back. That's what she does." Evelyn set the book on the windowsill and turned to look at him. He was watching her with that same careful expression, but there was something else underneath it now, something younger and more raw that he was working hard to cover. "I'm not here to replace your mother," she said. "I wouldn't know how." Something moved across his face. Not softening exactly, but a slight alteration, like a door that hadn't opened but had shifted slightly in its frame. "Supper's at 6, he said, and left. The first week was an education in how many ways a person could be wrong about what they thought they knew. She'd grown up cooking on her aunt and uncle's stove, which was a competent iron range from a reputable manufacturer, nothing to complain about. The stove in the ward kitchen was a different creature entirely, a massive old beast with its own opinions about heat distribution, hot on the left and temperamental on the right, with a firebox that required a specific sequence of damper adjustments that nobody had written down because whoever had known them was dead. Evelyn burned the first 2 batches of biscuits. The third batch came out edible but dense in a way that told her she'd gotten the temperature wrong again. She left them on the table at supper without comment. Nobody commented either, which she was grateful for. Caleb ate 2 of them without expression. Eli ate 3 and said they were good, which she suspected was more generosity than accuracy, and Rosie ate 1 and then went back to pushing her carrots around her plate. Micah ate 1, looked at her over his fork, and said nothing. She went to bed that night with her hands aching and a list in her head of everything she'd done wrong. The stovepipe, she discovered the next morning, was the key. There was a secondary damper she hadn't noticed, tucked behind the main body of the stove at an angle that seemed almost deliberately inconvenient, and it controlled the draw to the firebox in a way that changed everything about how the thing behaved. She found it because she spent an hour with a lamp studying the stove before she lit it, crouched on the cold kitchen floor in the gray early light, touching every surface until she understood what she was dealing with. The biscuits that morning were better. Not perfect. She'd overworked the dough slightly, and they were a little tough, but they rose correctly, and they browned evenly, and they tasted like biscuits rather than like regret. Caleb picked one up, looked at it, and ate it. He picked up a second one. She called that a victory and moved on. The sourdough starter, as Micah had said, was dead. A small crock sitting on the back of the counter with a gray-brown liquid on top that smelled of acetone and defeat. She pitched it out and started a new one from scratch, flour and water and patience, setting it in the warmest spot she could find near the stove. That would take a week minimum before it was usable. She noted this in her head. 1 week before real bread. The children were a harder puzzle. Rosie, she discovered quickly, operated through proximity. The girl didn't talk much in the first few days. She appeared near Evelyn while Evelyn worked, at a careful distance of about 4 feet, watching with the solemn attention of a scientist observing an unfamiliar specimen. She didn't ask to help. She didn't ask for anything. She just appeared and watched, clutching her rag doll, and if Evelyn spoke to her she would answer but wouldn't elaborate. And if Evelyn moved to a different part of the house, Rosie would, after a suitable interval that maintained the pretense that she had not been following, appear in that part of the house too. Evelyn didn't push it. She just let the girl orbit. Eli was easier in some ways and harder in others. He was a practical child, interested in how things worked, quick to lose patience with things that didn't make sense to him, with a habit of asking blunt questions at unexpected moments that made it clear he was working through something internally and had arrived at the point of requiring external data. "Did you want to come here, Egg?" he asked her on the 3rd day. He was supposed to be sweeping the porch and had stopped sweeping to ask this. She was mending a shirt on the porch steps and considered the question seriously. "I wanted to be somewhere safe," she said. "This seemed like it could be that." "Is it?" "So far." He thought about this. "Our last hired woman only stayed 2 weeks. She said it was too cold." "It is very cold." "But you're still here." "I'm still here," she agreed. He went back to sweeping. Micah was the wall she kept running into. Not hostile, exactly. He didn't say cruel things or go out of his way to make her life harder. He simply maintained a precise, consistent distance, performing the minimum required acknowledgement of her presence without ever letting it become something that could be mistaken for acceptance. He did his work. He looked after his siblings in the particular competent way of a boy who'd been keeping things together since before he should have had to. And he answered Evelyn's questions when they required answers, and that was all. She respected it. She didn't like it, but she respected it. Caleb himself was a puzzle of a different order. She saw him at meals, and sometimes in the kitchen in the early morning before the household woke, when he sat with coffee and whatever papers needed attending to. Account ledgers, notices from the land office, correspondence she didn't read. He was not unkind. He was not kind either. He occupied a careful middle space that she slowly came to understand was not the product of indifference, but of someone who had decided that careful distance was the only safe architecture. He'd lost his wife 14 months ago. She didn't know the details and didn't ask, but she could feel the shape of it in the house, in the way nobody ever talked about the woman, in the photograph on the mantel that everyone's eyes moved away from without seeming to, in the small evidence of her everywhere, a woman's handwriting on an old list pinned to the pantry wall, a pair of gloves still hanging on the hook by the back door. Clara Ward had been real and was gone, and the family had closed over her absence the way water closes over a stone. And whatever was happening on the surface bore no clear relation to what was happening underneath. Evelyn did not make the mistake of trying to address it. She had enough of her own absences to manage. The first time Caleb helped her, she didn't realize it was him. It was the end of the second week, and she'd spent an afternoon attempting to repair a harness strap that had split, a task she'd never done before and had approached with a manual confidence she didn't actually possess. She'd stitched it with the wax thread from the mending kit, pulling the pieces together as evenly as she could manage, and in the morning it had held through the light work Eli had used it for, and she'd felt a quiet satisfaction in that. Then Caleb had taken the harness out for heavier work, and it had split again, worse than before. She could see from the kitchen window the exact moment it happened, the way he'd stopped and looked at the strap in his hand with an expression that wasn't anger, but was close to the relatives of anger. He didn't say anything at supper. She waited for it, and it didn't come. The next morning, she went out to the barn to assess the damage and found the harness on the workbench, repaired. Properly repaired with saddle thread and the right kind of stitching pattern, the leather pieces realigned and set correctly. It was good work, the kind that would hold. She turned it over in her hands. Caleb was somewhere in the back of the barn doing something with fence wire. She could hear the sound of it. She didn't say anything. She hung the harness back on its peg and went back to the house. But she noted it. 2 days later, she found the damper adjustment sequence written on a slip of paper that had been slid under the kitchen door overnight. Just the steps, no explanation, no signature. She recognized the handwriting from the account ledgers she'd seen on the table. She studied the paper for a moment, then put it in her apron pocket. She thought, so that's how it is. It wasn't warmth exactly. She wouldn't call it that. But it was something, an acknowledgement that she existed and was trying, expressed in the only currency he apparently knew how to use. She filed it away carefully, the way you file things you're not sure what to do with yet, but know you'll need later. The sourdough starter came to life on the 8th day. She'd checked it every morning, stirring it, adding flour and water in the right proportions, watching the surface for the bubble and rise that meant it had caught. On the 8th morning, there it was, active and alive and smelling properly sour, a small ecosystem that had assembled itself out of flour and thyme and the particular wild yeasts floating around in this kitchen. She baked a loaf that afternoon, a real loaf, the kind with a proper crust, and she cut it while it was still warm and put it on the table, and nobody said anything, but Eli cut himself a second slice before supper, and Rosie ate hers holding it in both hands like something precious. Caleb looked at the bread and then at her and said, "Starter took." 8 days, she said. He nodded once. She sat down and they ate. Betum. The thing about Rosie happened on a Tuesday in the 3rd week, which was the kind of detail Evelyn would remember clearly later, because unremarkable days have a way of turning significant without warning. Evelyn was in the chicken coop doing the feed and count, a task she'd taken over because nobody else was doing it consistently, and the chickens had noticed. They were agitated and picking at each other, small signs of neglect that would become larger problems if left alone. She was concentrating on getting the count right, which required a kind of constant low-level focus because chickens were not cooperative in this regard. She didn't hear Rosie come in. She turned and found the girl standing in the coop doorway with her rag doll held out in front of her like an offering. "Her name's Clara," Rosie said. Evelyn went still. She knew the doll's name was probably not coincidental. "That's a nice name," she said carefully. "She was Mama's first." Rosie looked at the doll, not at Evelyn. "Mama said she could watch over me." Evelyn crouched down. She didn't reach for the doll. She just made herself small and waited. "She doesn't talk," Rosie said. "I know she doesn't really talk. I'm not a baby. I know you're not. But sometimes I pretend she does." Rosie looked up at her. Her eyes were very serious. "Is that stupid?" "No," Evelyn said. "That's not stupid at all." Rosie considered her for a long moment. Then she said, "I think she likes you." Evelyn's chest did something complicated. She kept her face even. "I'm glad," she said. Rosie nodded, apparently satisfied with this response, and tucked the doll back under her arm and wandered back out of the coop into the cold yard. And Evelyn turned back to the chickens and stood there for a moment, not really seeing them. She breathed in. She breathed out. She went back to counting. Micah's wall cracked. Not all the way, not even halfway, but cracked. On a Thursday evening when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours and the wind came up out of the north with serious intent. Caleb was out at the far fence line and wouldn't be back until after dark. Eli had a cough that had been getting worse for 3 days, and she'd sent him to bed with a mustard plaster and strict instructions. Rosie was asleep. Micah had been in the barn when the weather turned, and he'd come in looking like a man who'd walked through a wall, shaking with cold. He hadn't let himself show outside. She put coffee on without being asked. He sat at the table and wrapped both hands around the cup she put in front of him and stared at it. She went back to the stove and didn't look at him. "The north barn door needs a new bolt," he said after a while. "The latch is going. Is it holding tonight?" "For now. I can look at it tomorrow, if you show me what needs doing." Silence. She heard him drink his coffee. "You're not what I thought you were going to be," he said. She glanced at him. He was looking at the coffee cup, not at her. "What did you think I was going to be?" He shrugged, the particular non-committal shrug of a teenage boy who has strong opinions he hasn't decided to share yet. Someone who'd try to run things, or someone who'd cry a lot and leave. "I don't have anywhere to leave to," she said. He looked at her then. Something in the statement seemed to land differently than she'd intended it, not as bleakness, but as something he recognized. She saw it in his face, the flicker of a person who also knew what it was like to be unable to go anywhere else, who had also just had to stay and figure it out. "The bolt takes a 3/4 inch, he said. "I'll get one from town next supply run." "All right," she said. He finished his coffee and rinsed the cup at the basin. She hadn't expected that, the automatic courtesy of rinsing his own cup, and went to bed. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the wind shaking the windows and thought about all the things that were slowly, haltingly, insufficiently beginning. Not enough. Not yet. There was so much still hard and closed and wrong about this place and this arrangement and the life she'd been handed that she hadn't chosen. But something. She put out the kitchen lamp and went to bed in the small, cold room off the kitchen, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't lie awake for hours before sleep came. She was too tired, and being too tired, she thought, might be its own strange form of belonging. The bolt for the north barn door came back from town 3 days later, tucked inside a paper sack with the supply order, and Micah set it on the kitchen table in front of Evelyn without ceremony, the way you'd set down a tool for someone who'd asked to borrow it. She picked it up, turned it in her fingers, 3/4 inch, just as he'd said, and nodded. "Show me where," she asked. He looked at her sideways. "You don't have to do it. I can." "I know you can. I want to learn." He was quiet for a moment in that way he had, the way that was less rudeness and more a boy who'd learned to think before he spoke because words in this house had weight. "After supper," he said. "After supper," she agreed. That was how it went, most of the time. Not warm, not easy, but transactional in a way that was slowly becoming something else. Something she didn't have a clean word for yet. A mutual recognition, maybe, that they were both stuck here and both trying, and that trying counted for something even when it wasn't enough. February moved in like it intended to stay. The cold became a presence in the house rather than just a condition outside it, seeping under doors, crystallizing on the inside of windows in the early morning, making every chore take twice the time because you had to stop and rewarm your hands every 20 minutes or lose feeling in your fingers. Evelyn learned to layer 2 pairs of socks, an extra undershirt she'd found in the rag bag and re-sewed, mittens she knitted herself in the evenings from yarn that Meredith had tucked into the bottom of her trunk, which she'd found only when she'd repacked after the first week and sat there for a moment holding the skein like a letter. She knitted in the evenings by the stove, after the children were in bed and the kitchen was quiet. It was the only time that felt like it belonged to her. Sometimes Caleb was at the table with his papers during those evenings, and sometimes he wasn't. When he was, they existed in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but had stopped being awkward. 2 people in the same room, both occupied, neither requiring anything from the other. She found she didn't mind it. She'd lived with Gerald Carter for 9 years, and Gerald's silence had always felt like a judgment. Caleb's silence felt more like weather, something you were in, not something directed at you. Once, late on a Wednesday, he looked up from his ledger and said, "The Henderson's in town. Martha Henderson. She does a women's sewing circle Thursday afternoons, if you wanted to go." She looked at him. He was looking at the ledger again. "Is that something you think I should do?" she asked. "I think you haven't been off this property in 3 weeks." He turned a page. "That's something I notice." She went back to her knitting. "I'll think about it," she said. She didn't go. Not that week. She filed it away, though. The fact that he'd noticed, the fact that he'd said something about it, the fact that he'd phrased it the way he had. Something I notice. Not a command, not even a suggestion with an edge. Just an observation offered neutrally, like the damper instructions slid under the door. She was building a picture, piece by piece, of what Caleb Ward actually was underneath the stone face and the careful distance. And it was different from what the stone face suggested. Different wasn't the same as easy. She didn't confuse the two. Eli's cough didn't go away. She'd been watching it for 2 weeks, tracking it with the quiet vigilance of someone who'd learned to notice things early, because noticing early was the only advantage available to her. It had started as a chest cold, wet and deep, the kind that took up residence and refused to leave, and she'd treated it the way she knew how, mustard plasters and steam and broth, keeping him warm, keeping him resting as much as a 10-year-old boy would tolerate resting, which was not much. But by the 3rd week it had changed pitch. The cough was looser and he was running a low fever that came and went, and there were mornings when he came to breakfast pale and shadowed under the eyes in a way that sat wrong with her. She raised it with Caleb at supper on a Friday. "Eli's chest isn't clearing," she said. Caleb looked at his son across the table. Eli was eating, but there was less appetite than usual. "Been watching it," Caleb said. "I think he needs a doctor." There was a beat of quiet. Eli looked up, interested in this conversation now. "Doc Morrow's in Delmore," Caleb said. 40 minutes in good conditions." "I know that." "Roads are iced." "I know that too." She kept her voice even. "I still think he should be seen." Caleb looked at Eli for a long moment, the kind of look that was measuring something she couldn't read. Then he said, "Tomorrow morning, if the road's passable." "I'll go with you," Evelyn said, "if you don't object." He didn't say he didn't object. But he also didn't say he did, which was, she'd learned, often the same thing. The road was passable. Barely. And only because Caleb drove well and the horses knew worse conditions than this. But they made it to Delmore in just under an hour with Eli wedged between them on the wagon seat, bundled in every layer Evelyn had been able to justify putting on him without making him feel like an invalid. He had not protested the layers, which told her more than anything else about how he actually felt. Doc Morrow was a compact, efficient man in his 60s who had the manner of someone who'd seen every variety of frontier illness and emergency and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. He listened to Eli's chest with his stethoscope for a careful while, asked the boy to breathe in specific ways, tapped his fingers along the rib cage, and then looked at Evelyn rather than at Caleb. "How long has it been like this?" 3 weeks total. Changed character about a week ago." You've been giving him steam. Every morning and evening. Eucalyptus oil in the water when I have it. He nodded, then looked at Caleb. She's right to have brought him in. There's some congestion settling in the lower lung. Not pneumonia yet, but it's heading that direction if you don't get ahead of it. He began writing. I'll give you a tincture. 2 doses a day with warm liquid. Keep him inside. No barn work for at least 10 days. He looked at Eli. I know you hate that. I don't hate it, Eli said, with the tone of a boy who definitely hated it. You'll survive the boredom, the doctor said. He handed the paper to Evelyn, then stopped and looked at her again. You're new, he said. Ward's wife? The word landed oddly, as it always did. She hadn't decided yet what to do with it. Evelyn, she said. Evelyn Ward. It was the first time she'd said it as a complete thing, and she heard the strangeness of it. You're doing right by these children, he said simply and without elaboration, and went to get the tincture. In the wagon on the way home, Eli sat between them and fell asleep with his head against her arm, which he hadn't anticipated and didn't move away from. The cold pressed in from all sides, and the horses moved steadily through the gray afternoon, and she sat there with this small boy sleeping against her, and looked out at the white fields and felt something strange and aching in her chest that she couldn't name. Caleb said, You pushed on that. She glanced at him. He was watching the road. He needed to be seen, she said. I know. A pause. I'm saying you pushed when it needed pushing. That's not a complaint. She looked at the road, too. All right, she said. Nothing else was said for the rest of the drive, and that was fine. The sewing circle was on a Thursday in late February, and she went, finally, because Rosie asked to come with her, and it seemed wrong to say no. Martha Henderson was a tall, forthright woman in her 40s who ran the circle with the cheerful efficiency of someone who genuinely liked both sewing and people and saw no reason not to combine them as often as possible. There were 6 women in the group when Evelyn arrived, and they made space for her without fuss, which she was grateful for, and she sat next to a woman named Dora Finch, who was mending a curtain with the focused intensity of someone settling a personal grievance. Ward's new wife, Dora said, not looking up, not meanly, just placing her. Evelyn, she said. Yes. How is he? This from Martha, who had looked up. Working, Evelyn said. The children are well. Martha exchanged a glance with someone across the circle that Evelyn caught and chose not to react to. She'd expected this. The scrutiny of a small community assessing a new variable. She kept her hands on her mending and her expression pleasant. Caleb Ward hasn't been into town much since Clara passed, Martha said, and there was nothing cruel in it, just a statement of fact from a woman who kept track of her community. We worried about those children. They're managing, Evelyn said. You're managing them, Dora said. That's different. Rosie, sitting at Evelyn's feet with a small piece of fabric Martha had given her to practice stitches on, looked up at this exchange with the antenna sensitivity of a child who understood more of adult conversation than adults generally credited. Miss Evelyn makes the bread, Rosie announced to the general circle. It has bubbles in it. There was a ripple of genuine warmth around the group, and Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since January. On the drive home, Evelyn had borrowed the small cart and the reliable old mare that Caleb had said without much ceremony she could use when she needed. Rosie sat beside her and held her rag doll and watched the road with the thoughtful expression she got sometimes that made her look like a small philosopher. Are those ladies your friends? Rosie asked. I don't know yet, Evelyn said honestly. Maybe they will be. Mama had friends, Rosie said. She used to go on Thursdays sometimes. She stroked the doll's hair. I forgot it was the same day. Evelyn kept her eyes on the road and let the silence hold for a moment. We can find a different day, if you'd rather. Rosie shook her head. No. I think Mama would say it was all right. She considered. She used to say there was enough room in Thursdays for more than one thing. Evelyn didn't trust herself to say anything to that, so she just put her arm around the girl's thin shoulders, and they rode the rest of the way home without talking, the cart moving through the late afternoon light, and Evelyn thought about a woman she'd never met who'd apparently said smart things about Thursdays, and she thought that she'd have liked her. March came in with a brief thaw that turned the yard into a bog for 4 days and then froze again, which made the mud permanent and inconvenient. The chickens, who had strong feelings about mud, made their feelings known continuously. Evelyn dealt with this, and with the discovery that the root cellar inventory she'd done in January had not accounted for a section of the back wall where a half-dozen jars of preserved vegetables had gone bad, which meant the spring provisions were thinner than she'd thought. She went through the pantry on a Sunday afternoon and did the accounting carefully, writing it down, what they had, how long it needed to last, where the shortfalls were. Then she sat at the kitchen table with the list and thought. Caleb came in from the barn and saw her at the table and stopped. "What's that?" "Pantry inventory. We're lighter on protein than I'd like for March. The salt pork won't carry us past mid-month." She pushed the list across the table. "I thought you should see it." He sat down across from her and read it. She watched him read it, not his expression, which didn't give much, but his hands, which tapped once against the table in a rhythm that told her he was thinking. "Henderson's store might carry us on credit against spring," he said. "That's an option, or—" She hesitated. "I could take the chickens that aren't laying, 3 of them right now, sell them to Martha Henderson or trade for salt pork. It won't close the gap completely, but it helps." He looked at her. "You worked that out?" "I've been working it out since Tuesday," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do it. The trade makes more sense than credit." "I'll go Tuesday." He nodded and stood and took the list with him, which she understood to mean he was going to think about the rest of it. She went back to her mending and didn't overthink what had just happened, but she noted it. The way he'd taken her accounting seriously. No qualification, no second guessing. "You worked that out." Not a compliment exactly, but something in the neighborhood of one. She was getting better at reading the neighborhood. It was Micah who told her about Clara in the end. Not deliberately, not in the way of someone who'd decided to tell something, but in the sideways manner of information that comes out when a person is tired and a little off guard and has been carrying something for long enough that it starts to leak through the seams. It was an evening in mid-March. They'd been in the barn together fixing a split board in one of the stalls. She'd been helping him hold the plank in place while he drove the nails, a task requiring more patience than skill, and they'd been working in silence for a while. The barn smelled of hay and horse and cold timber. The lamp hanging from the center beam threw a steady yellow light over everything. He drove the last nail, and they both stepped back and looked at the board. "My mother built that stall," he said, not looking at her, looking at the board. She didn't say anything. "She and my father, first year on this place, she used to say she built it crooked on purpose so nobody could accuse her of doing it perfect." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought she was joking. Eli and I measured it last summer. It really is crooked, 3 degrees off plumb." "Did she do a lot of the building?" "More than people thought. Women out here do more than people think." He finally looked at her sideways. "She got sick fast. That's the thing everyone doesn't say. It was barely 2 months from when she got sick to when she was gone." He picked up the hammer and turned it in his hands. Papa was already somewhere else in his head by the time she died. Like he'd lost her before it was official. By the time it was official, he didn't know how to come back. Evelyn absorbed this carefully. "That sounds like something that would be hard to watch," she said. "It was." He set the hammer down on the workbench. "He's not like that because he doesn't care. That's what I need you to understand." He was looking at her directly now, with that careful intensity he'd had since the beginning. He shuts down because he doesn't know what else to do. He always did that. Mama used to call it going into the blizzard. "Going into the blizzard," she repeated. "Yeah," she said, "a blizzard looks like it goes on forever. But if you just wait in one place and don't try to move around in it, it ends and you can see again." He picked up the lamp. "I don't know if that's true, but she believed it." They walked back to the house in the cold without talking, and Evelyn carried what he told her the way you carry something fragile, carefully, not clutching at it, trying not to let the handling change it. She thought about what it meant that Micah had told her this. Not a softening, exactly. More like a flag planted in uncertain territory. This is what we are. This is what we've been through. Now you know. She thought she understood what he was really saying underneath it. Don't give up on him. She hadn't been planning to. The fragile rhythm that had built up over the weeks was not peace. She didn't think it was peace, and she was careful not to mistake it for something it wasn't. There were still mornings when she felt the weight of everything that was wrong about her situation with a clarity that made her chest tight. There were still evenings when she sat in her small room and let herself feel, for just a few minutes, the full scope of what she'd lost and what she'd never had. The choice, the courtship that hadn't happened, the simple dignity of having been asked rather than assigned. She gave herself those minutes, and then she got up and went back to work because that was what you did. But the rhythm was real. It had built on small things, the bread every other day, the children's improving ease with her, Eli explaining to her at length and with genuine enthusiasm how the barn pulley system worked, Rosie beginning to talk more freely, asking questions about the knitting and the cooking, and once, unexpectedly, about Evelyn's own mother, what she'd been like. She was practical, Evelyn said. She could fix most things. She used to say if you understood how something broke, you could understand how to put it back together. Did she fix things a lot? Everything she could. She paused. Some things can't be fixed. She understood that too. Rosie processed this with the serious attention she brought to most things. My mama fixed things too, she said. Papa doesn't fix things much. He gets Micah to do it. Evelyn thought of the harness, the damper note. I think your papa fixes more than you know, she said. He just does it quietly. Rosie tilted her head. Like when he puts wood by the door before bedtime so we don't have to go out in the cold to get it in the morning? Yes, Evelyn said, though she hadn't known he did that. Exactly like that. And there it was again. The small accumulation of evidence that she was still building into a picture, piece by piece, of a man who had decided that care was something you expressed through action because language was too exposed, too available to loss. She thought she understood that in a way. She'd been raised by someone who didn't speak feeling either. The difference was that Caleb's silence seemed to come from grief, rather than from the absence of anything to say. Late one evening, she came into the kitchen for water, and he was at the table, not with his papers, but just sitting, hands around a cold cup of coffee, looking at nothing. He didn't hear her come in, or maybe he did and didn't react. She poured her water and was about to go back to bed when he said quietly, "She would have liked you." She stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. "Clara," he said. She liked people who pushed back a little, who didn't just fold. He was still looking at the table. I'm not saying it means anything. I just thought it. Evelyn stood at the kitchen counter with her cup of water and thought about what to say and decided on the truth, which was, "Thank you for telling me." He nodded. She went back to bed. She lay in her small room off the kitchen and listened to the wind and thought that something had shifted tonight. Some plate of ground that had been locked in place had moved, just slightly, just barely. Not enough to change the landscape, but enough to feel. And she also thought that she should be careful with that feeling, should not build on it too fast or lean on it too hard, because the ground here was still uncertain, and what felt like a shift could turn out to be the beginning of something falling. She was right to be careful. She just didn't know yet how right. The weeks continued and the work continued and the rhythm held. Imperfect, halting, requiring constant small adjustments, nothing like what anyone would write in a letter home to describe as happiness. But it was something. The children woke and needed things, and she provided them. The stove was managed and the bread was baked and the provisions stretched further than she'd thought they could because she was persistent and creative with what she had. Eli recovered fully from his chest trouble and spent 3 days being aggressively helpful to compensate for the 10 days he'd been kept inside, which exhausted everyone around him, but which she found, privately, completely endearing. Micah didn't become easy, but he became something she could read. She learned the difference between his silence that meant disapproval and his silence that meant he was simply thinking, and she learned that when he asked her opinion on something practical, a fence repair, the best way to organize the feed storage, he was asking genuinely and not as a test. She learned that he made dry jokes sometimes that came so flatly delivered that you could miss them entirely if you weren't paying attention, and that when she laughed at them, his face didn't change, but something in his posture did. Caleb remained Caleb, closed and careful and present in the half-hidden ways she'd cataloged and was still cataloging. He came in for supper every evening and ate what she put on the table and occasionally said something about the food that wasn't quite a compliment but was adjacent to one. He fixed things and left the evidence without claiming it. He left notes when something needed doing that he couldn't get to himself, precise and functional, never wasting words. Once he left her a note that said only, "The Hendersons have a lending library. Martha Henderson said to tell you." She read it twice, then smiled at the paper, which she was alone in the room to do, and said nothing about it to him, but went to the Henderson library on her next trip to town and came back with 2 books, which Eli immediately wanted to read, and which she agreed to read aloud in the evenings. And the books became a household thing, a thing that happened, another thread in the texture of what they were building. She thought sometimes that building was the right word for it, not healing, which implied something that had been whole before, not becoming, which was too certain about what the ending looked like. Building, which was slow and required tools and effort and the willingness to set something down if it wasn't right and find a better way to fit the pieces. There was still so much that could go wrong. She knew this. She could feel it in the fragility of the thing, the way it still depended on everyone's continued willingness to keep trying, the way any one person stepping back could unravel what they'd assembled. She kept trying. She went to bed most nights tired in her bones, which she'd come to think of as the honest kind of tired, the kind that meant you'd done something real with the day. The Wyoming winter did not relent. The cold stayed hard through March and into early April, with one last brutal week where the temperature dropped and stayed and made everyone inside the ward house short-tempered and slightly desperate in the way that people get when they've been cold for too long and it starts to feel personal. It was in that last cold week that she overheard the conversation in the barn. She hadn't meant to be there. She'd gone out for the evening feeding because Micah had a sore shoulder from fence work, and she'd told him she could manage it. She'd come around the side of the barn in the dark, heading for the feed door, when she heard Caleb's voice from inside, low and even, the way he talked when he was talking to himself or to the horses, without performance. He was talking to someone, though. She heard a second voice, older, familiar. Tom Briggs, she thought, the neighboring rancher who came by sometimes to talk fence lines and cattle prices. She had stopped without deciding to stop, her hand on the cold barn wall, and in the moment before she could have moved away, she heard Caleb say, "She's working out well enough." And Tom's voice, "You sound surprised." "I am, some. Gerald Carter isn't known for his generosity." A pause. She heard him moving inside, a boot on the barn floor. "She's good with the children. Does the work? Doesn't complain where I can hear it. And nothing. It's convenient. Flat, certain." It needed to be convenient, and it is. That's what this was. She stood in the cold dark with her hand flat against the barn wall and let those words arrange themselves in the space behind her ribs. It's convenient. That's what this was. She had known this. She had always known this. She had told herself she knew this, had built her understanding of this arrangement on exactly this foundation, that she was a transaction, that she'd arrived as a solution to a practical problem, that nothing about the way Caleb Ward looked at her or didn't look at her implied anything more than the management of a household that needed managing. She had known it, and she had continued anyway, had built the bread and the sewing circle and the evenings by the stove and the conversations with his children, had let Rosie fall asleep against her shoulder on the cart ride home from town, had let Micah's careful confidence mean something to her, had let herself feel, in those quiet moments at the kitchen table, that she was beginning to belong somewhere for the first time, and she had known it was foolish, and she had let it happen anyway. And now she was standing in the Wyoming dark at the end of a cold march, hearing the truth of it stated plainly, and it was not new information, and it felt, regardless, like something breaking. She pulled her hand from the wall. She walked back to the house. She did not do the evening feeding. She stood in her small room off the kitchen for a long time without lighting the lamp, standing in the dark and the cold. She was not going to cry. She had not cried since she'd left her uncle's house, had not let herself, because once she started, she didn't trust herself to stop, and she had too much work to do to be unable to stop. She did not cry, but she stood in the dark room for a long time and let herself feel how far she was from anywhere that had ever been hers, and how she had started to believe that might be changing, and how the particular specific ache of believing something and then finding out it was wrong was its own category of cold. In the kitchen, she could hear the stove ticking as it cooled for the night. Tomorrow she would get up and light it again. She would make the bread. She would feed the children and manage the house and do the work. because that was what she was here for, and she had always known that, and she would not be unmade by hearing it said plainly. But tonight she stood in the dark and let it cost her what it cost. She got up the next morning and lit the stove. That was what she did. She got up in the gray pre-dawn, and she went to the kitchen in her wool socks and her extra undershirt, and she opened the firebox and built the fire the way she'd learned. The damper sequence she knew by heart now, the particular angle of the kindling that caught fastest in cold air. And she stood there watching the flame take hold, and she did not think about what she'd heard in the barn. She thought about bread. She thought about whether the salt pork would stretch another 4 days or only 3. She thought about Eli's boots, which needed new soles before spring mud made the old ones useless. She thought about everything except the thing she wasn't going to think about. And if that was a form of lying to herself, it was the functional kind, the kind that let you keep moving. Caleb came down at his usual time and poured his coffee and sat at the table with his papers. And she put biscuits on and didn't look at him, and he didn't look at her, and nothing was different from any other morning except that inside her chest, something had rearranged itself in the night into a new configuration. Harder, more ordered, the soft parts tucked away behind something practical and load-bearing. She had built herself this way before. She knew how. Roads should be better this week, he said to his papers. Good, she said to the stove. That was the whole of it. The days that followed had the quality of something held very carefully. She moved through the house and the work with a precision that she recognized from the outside might look like competence, but was actually the controlled attention of someone who couldn't afford to let their mind go anywhere unsupervised. She was thorough. She was efficient. She answered questions and managed the children and dealt with the chickens and the pantry and the stove and the 1,000 small crises of a frontier household in early spring, and she did all of it with the even, contained manner of a woman who had made a private decision about where the boundaries were and intended to hold them. Rosie noticed first. Children always did. "Are you sad?" she asked one afternoon, appearing at Evelyn's elbow while she was sorting dried beans at the kitchen table. "No," Evelyn said. Then, because Rosie deserved better than a flat lie, "I'm tired." "You were tired before, and you didn't look like this." Evelyn looked at her. The girl was watching her with Clara's eyes, dark and direct and not easily deflected. "I'm working something out," Evelyn said. "In my head. Sometimes that makes a person quiet." Rosie thought about this seriously. "Micah does that too," she said. "He gets all still, and you can't tell what he's thinking." "Is that so?" I usually poke him until he talks." She considered. "I could do that for you." Despite everything, Evelyn almost smiled. "I'll let you know if I need poking," she said. Rosie nodded, satisfied, and climbed onto the chair across the table and began sorting beans too, without being asked, making a small pile of the split and damaged ones with the focused seriousness she brought to everything. Evelyn watched her hands for a moment, small and quick, sure of what they were doing, and felt the complicated ache of caring about someone in a situation where caring was a liability. She'd been careful about this. She'd told herself she'd been careful. But you couldn't be in a house with children for 3 months without the caring just happening, slow and incremental, and completely outside the realm of decisions. She'd let it happen anyway. That had been the foolish part. But the first real warmth of spring came in the second week of April, tentative and brief, the sun appearing through the gray with enough strength to make the snow on the south-facing slopes begin to recede. Water ran in the ruts of the yard. The mud that replaced the ice was its own problem, but it was a different problem, the kind that meant the season was actually changing, that winter was losing its grip. Evelyn did not feel the lifting that she'd expected to feel. She'd thought vaguely that spring would help, that getting through the winter would feel like something accomplished, that the warming would thaw whatever had frozen in her after the barn. Instead, she moved through the improving weather with the same controlled flatness she'd maintained for the past 3 weeks, doing the work, managing the house, being present without being entirely there. Eli asked her once if she was feeling well, and she said yes, and he looked at her with the particular expression of a 10-year-old boy who knew that was only partially true and had made the calculation that pressing further was above his pay grade. Micah said nothing, but she caught him watching her a few times with the measuring look she'd come to associate with him working something out. He was perceptive, Micah, more perceptive than he probably wanted to be at his age. She thought sometimes that he'd been forced into noticing things by the experience of his mother's illness and his father's subsequent retreat, that he'd developed the habit of reading people carefully because the people in his house had stopped announcing their states, and he'd had to learn to see them anyway. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her now. She didn't ask. Caleb moved through the household with his customary contained efficiency, and she could not tell, still could not tell, after everything, whether the distance she felt from him was new or whether she had simply stopped filtering it the way she had before. She had stopped looking for the small evidences of his care. She still received them. The wood by the door, a note about the east fence needing attention before the spring thaw made the posts unstable. The quiet way he'd backed her decision when she'd told Eli he needed to finish the school correspondence work before he went to the barn. But she'd stopped letting them mean what she'd allowed them to mean before. That had been the correction she'd made. A small recalibration. Nothing dramatic. She was managing. It was a Tuesday in the third week of April when everything stopped managing. The morning had been ordinary. Bread, breakfast, Rosie's lessons at the kitchen table, Eli and Micah out with Caleb moving the cattle to the south pasture now that the snow had cleared enough. She'd spent the afternoon on the mending pile that never fully resolved itself, working through it steadily in the good light from the south window, the house quiet around her in the particular way it got when all the men were out. She'd run low on thread and gone to the basket she kept in the back room, the small room that had been the hired man's and was now hers, and while she was crouched in front of the trunk, something shifted in the ground outside, a sound she didn't immediately identify. And then she heard the wagon coming in faster than usual, the particular rhythm of horses pushed rather than paced. She was on the porch by the time the wagon came through the gate. Caleb was driving and Micah was in the back, and Eli... She saw it before she understood it, the way you see something wrong before your brain is caught up with the assessment. Eli was lying in the wagon bed with Micah's jacket under his head and his face the color of old paper. She was down the porch steps and at the wagon before it had fully stopped. What happened? East fence, Caleb said, already climbing down. His voice was tight, controlled in a way that meant he was working hard at it. Post came out of the ground when he was leaning on it. He went down the bank into the creek. How far? 8 feet, maybe. Hit his shoulder and his head on the way. She was already in the wagon bed beside Eli. He was conscious. His eyes were open and tracking her. But his face was wrong, slack in a way that scared her. Hey, she said. Eli, look at me. I'm looking, he said. His voice was slow. Everything's kind of... He stopped. Kind of what? Sideways. He blinked. My shoulder hurts. I know. We're going to take care of it. She looked at his pupils, uneven. Her stomach dropped. We need to get him tomorrow, she said to Caleb, not looking up. Now. His pupils aren't right. She felt Caleb go still beside the wagon. That means his head, she said, because she needed him to understand the urgency without panic. I know what it means. He was already moving back to the wagon seat. Micah, get up front. I'll stay with him, Evelyn said. Caleb looked at her over the wagon side. For a moment she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled flatness, not the careful distance, but something raw underneath, something that had been live all along under the management of it. Hold his head still, he said. If he tries to sit up, don't let him. I know, she said. They drove to Delmore in 40 minutes, which was fast on roads still soft from the thaw, and she held Eli's head steady the whole way with both hands and talked to him. Not about anything, just kept talking, kept her voice even, asked him about the cattle, about what he'd been doing before the fence post gave, about whether he thought the sourdough starter she'd been maintaining tasted different in winter than in spring. And he answered in the slow, sideways voice. And she kept him answering because Doc Morrow had told her once, at the tail end of the winter visit, that the important thing with head injuries was keeping them conscious and responsive. She had stored that away at the time without knowing why. Doc Morrow was there and took over with the competent efficiency she'd come to trust. And she stepped back into the waiting area of his small office and stood there while Caleb sat in the single chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands locked together and stared at the floor. She should have sat. She should have done something. Instead, she stood at the window and watched the street of Delmore go about its afternoon business. the ordinary commerce of a small frontier town, and felt the fear that she'd been suppressing for the past 40 minutes finally make its way through to the surface. She was scared for Eli. She was genuinely, essentially scared for him in the way you were scared for people who mattered to you. And she knew, with the particular clarity of moments like this, when pretending gets stripped away, that he mattered to her, that all three of them mattered to her, in a way that had nothing to do with the arrangement that had brought her here. Caleb said from the chair, "He's strong." She didn't turn from the window. "I know he is. He's always been the one who gets back up." A pause. "When he was 7, he fell out of the loft, 8 feet. Clara nearly lost her mind. He was up and asking for supper by afternoon." She turned then and looked at him. He was still looking at the floor. "He's going to be all right," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she said honestly. "But I think it's true." He looked up at her then. Really looked at her, the way he almost never did, without the careful management of it. She held the look and didn't do anything with it, just let it be what it was. Doc Morrow came out after an hour. "Concussion," he said, "and a separated shoulder, but nothing broken, nothing worse than what it appeared to be. Eli would need rest, real rest, lying down, no reading in dim light, no sudden movement, for at least a week, possibly 2. And the shoulder would need strapping and take longer to heal, but he was going to be all right." She heard Caleb exhale beside her, a long, controlled breath that told her how much he'd been holding. Eli came home in the wagon that evening with his arms strapped and a bandage around his head, and an expression that suggested he was already resenting the enforced rest, and Rosie cried when she saw him, which she hadn't expected, and Micah didn't cry but sat beside his brother's bed for the better part of that evening without being asked to, doing nothing in particular, just being there. Evelyn made supper. She made the best supper she could from what they had. Salt pork with preserved vegetables, fresh biscuits, the last of the apple preserves she'd been rationing since February. She put it on the table and called everyone to eat, and they came and sat, and the house was loud for the first time she could remember. Everyone talking, Eli holding court from his chair at the table that Caleb had insisted he be allowed to eat at rather than in bed, recounting the fence post story with the narrative embellishment of a boy who had realized his injury was impressive and intended to get appropriate mileage from it. She sat at her end of the table and ate and listened and felt the fear finally leaving her body, draining away slowly, and what replaced it was something complicated and unresolved and real. She looked at Caleb across the table. He was watching his children, all 3 of them, the telling glance that parents made, the involuntary inventory of the people they were responsible for. He caught her eye, briefly, and the look on his face was, she didn't have a word for it. Not gratitude exactly, but something in the same territory. Something that acknowledged she'd been there today in the wagon and at the doctor's office, and now at this table. She looked away first. The nights got warmer in late April, and with the warmth came the mud season in full force, and with the mud season came the particular grinding tedium of spring work on a cattle ranch, fence repair, soil turning, the endless logistics of moving livestock, and managing the complications that winter had deferred. Caleb and Micah were out from first light until well past dark most days. Eli, still recovering, was confined to the house, which was making him difficult in the specific way of an active child deprived of activity. He'd been begging for 3 days to be allowed outside. 5 minutes, he told her on a Wednesday morning, just to stand on the porch. Doc Morrow said a week, she said. It's been 6 days. It's been 5.5. He looked at her with magnificent resentment. You're counting halves now. When it matters, yes. He slumped in his chair with an eloquence that she privately found somewhat admirable. Rosie gets to go outside. Rosie didn't fall 8 feet into a creek. One time, he muttered, one time I fall into a creek. She let him sit with his grievance and went back to the stove, where she was doing a second attempt at a dried apple cake that had come out flat the first time because the baking powder was older than she'd realized. She was working through the possible adjustments, more eggs maybe, or a bit of vinegar for the lift, when she heard the creak of the back door. She turned. Eli was not in his chair. She went to the back door and opened it. He was on the porch steps, sitting with his face tipped up to the morning sun, his eyes closed, his expression one of pure and uncomplicated relief. He heard her come out and opened one eye. I'm sitting down, he said. My head is not moving. She looked at him for a moment. He looked terrible still. The bruising under his eye was going yellow at the edges. The bandage on his head was slightly askew, but he was also clearly experiencing something essential, the first real sun on his face in 6 days. 10 minutes, she said, then back inside. He closed his eye again. 15. 12. Deal, he said, with the speed of someone who'd been aiming for 12 all along. She sat on the porch step beside him, and they sat there in the April morning, both of them quiet, the yard beginning to dry in patches where the sun hit it, the barn cats moving through the mud with the exaggerated dignity that cats maintained in undignified conditions. Miss Evelyn, Eli said. Are you going to stay? She looked at him. His eyes were still closed, face still up to the sun. What makes you ask that? She said carefully. You've been different the last few weeks. He opened his eyes and looked at her. Not bad different, just like you decided something. She was quiet for a moment. I'm here, she said. That's not nothing. I know. He looked at the yard. He stopped. Started again. We had a woman come in September before you. She said she'd stay and then she didn't, and one before that. He picked at the bandage edge absently, and she reached over and moved his hand away from it without thinking. I'm not asking because I'm scared, he said. I just want to know. She thought about the honest answer. She thought about what the honest answer actually was, which she hadn't fully articulated to herself yet. I'm not planning to leave, she said. That's the truest thing I can tell you right now. He seemed to think about this and find it sufficient. Okay, he said. They sat until the 12 minutes were up, and then she sent him back inside, and she stayed on the porch a moment longer and looked at the yard and the barn and the fence line in the distance and thought, not planning to leave. It was the truth. She'd made it to the other side of the hardest thing, the night in the dark room, the weeks of cold maintenance, and she was still here, still trying, and somewhere in the process of maintaining the house and the bread and the children while her chest was split in half, something had happened that she hadn't fully tracked. She wasn't here just because she had nowhere to go. She was here because she'd stopped being nowhere and started being somewhere. She wasn't sure when it had happened. These things didn't announce themselves. The night it all broke apart was a Friday, late April, cold again. One of those final insults that Wyoming spring delivered regularly. A night where the temperature dropped back into winter territory without warning. The kind of cold that came in off the high country and changed the air before anyone had adapted back from the brief warmth. She'd banked the kitchen stove before bed and put extra wood by the door, and she'd been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when something woke her. Not a sound, exactly. More an absence of something, a change in the way the house felt. She lay still for a moment and listened. The wind had come up. She could hear it against the windows. And under the wind there was something else, a different quality to the air coming under the door of her room. She got up and opened the door. The kitchen was cold. The stove had gone out. She lit the lamp and checked the firebox. The coals had died, which shouldn't have happened if she'd banked it correctly. And she stood there for a moment irritated at herself before she noticed that the back door was not fully latched, that it was moving slightly in the wind pressure, a gap of perhaps an inch, letting the cold air run directly across the floor toward the stove. She went to close it and stopped. Through the gap she could see light from the barn. The barn lantern was on, which meant Caleb was out there. Not unusual. He sometimes went out late to check the cattle when weather changed. But there were voices, and one of them was Tom Briggs again. And the other was a voice she hadn't heard before. A third man she didn't know. She should have closed the door and gone back to bed. She should have. She stood in the cold kitchen with her hand on the door and heard Caleb say, "It's a fair arrangement. She runs the house. The children are being looked after." Tom's voice said something she couldn't quite make out. Then the third man said, "And when the children are grown, what then?" A silence. She stood very still. Caleb said, "I don't think that far ahead." "You might want to," Tom said. "Woman who runs your house for 3 months develops expectations, Caleb. That's just how it is." Another silence. She could hear the wind. She could hear her own pulse. "She doesn't have expectations," Caleb said. His voice was flat and certain. She came here because she had no better option. She stays because the arrangement works. There's no... He stopped, started again, differently. She's not here for... She's not what Clara was. She's not going to be. That's not what this is. She closed the door. She did it carefully, without sound, pressing the latch down until she felt it catch. And then she stood in the kitchen, and she was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She's not what Clara was. She's not going to be. That's not what this is. She'd known it. She'd known it since the first night she'd spent in the dark with the sound of the stove ticking. She had rebuilt herself after the first conversation in the barn, had adjusted, had recalibrated, had accepted the parameters and worked within them. But this was different. This was not It's convenient. This was she is not capable of being what Clara was. This was a verdict about what she was and wasn't, delivered to another man in the barn at midnight, flat and certain, like a property assessment. She had managed the first time by putting the knowledge in a box and getting up in the morning and lighting the stove and making the bread. She stood in the kitchen and understood, with a clarity that felt like something shattering cleanly, that she could not do it again. She went back to her room. She did not cry. She sat on the edge of the cot with her hands in her lap and thought, very carefully and without rushing, about what was true and what she was going to do. What was true was that she had given this household 4 months of herself, her work and her attention and her patience, and something she didn't have a clean word for, something that was more than labor and more than endurance, something that had grown out of Rosie's ragdoll and Eli's beans and Micah telling her about his mother in the barn by lamplight. She had given that without being asked to give it, and without expecting anything particular in return. What was true was that she was not required to give it indefinitely to a man who could not see her for what she was. She did not decide exactly in the sitting and the thinking. But somewhere in the hours she spent in the dark on the edge of her cot, something became inevitable that had not been inevitable before. She packed her trunk with the same efficiency she'd applied to everything in this house. She did not pack slowly, sentimentally, in the way of movie scenes. She packed practically, taking what was hers and leaving what wasn't. The book on the windowsill, the extra undershirt, the knitting, because she'd made it and it was hers, the slip of paper with the damper instructions because she'd been given it and it was hers. She left the sourdough starter on the kitchen counter. She'd built it from nothing and she was leaving it for the household, which she thought was a fair accounting. She wrote a note. She wrote it 3 times because the first 2 versions said things she didn't want to say and didn't have the right to say. The 3rd version said, the starter needs feeding every 2 days. Warm water, not hot. The East Pantry shelf has enough flour to last until June if you're careful. She left it on the kitchen table with the lamp. She put on her coat, the good coat, the one Meredith had pressed on her. She picked up her trunk. She opened the front door. The cold hit her like a wall. The wind was serious now, carrying the particular smell that she'd learned over the winter meant snow was coming. Not a light snow, but a real one, the kind the high country sent down when it was angry about the turn of the season. She could see maybe 30 feet in front of her before the darkness and the wind erased the rest. She was aware, from the rational part of her that was still operating, that this was a bad time to be leaving on foot, that Delmore was 20 miles in the dark on roads that might be icing, that she was carrying a trunk that weighed 40 pounds. The rational part of her noted all of this, and she walked down the porch steps anyway, into the yard, into the cold and the wind and the beginning of the snow, because she was done making the rational choice inside a situation that was not, at its core, rational. She had been handed over like property and had made the best of it, and had been assessed like property again in the dark, and she was done. The snow found her at the edge of the property, at the gate in the fence where the ranch road met the main road. She stopped there and looked back at the house, the light in the barn still on, the kitchen lamp she'd left burning visible through the window. She turned away from it and walked into the snow. She had gone perhaps half a mile when the cold became something she could feel in her lungs, sharp and serious. The snow was falling in earnest now, the kind that came in sideways with the wind and reduced visibility to nothing, and the road had already lost its edges. She could feel the difference in surface under her boots when she drifted off it into the grass and had to correct herself. She walked. She kept walking. The trunk became heavier and she shifted it from hand to hand. Her fingers went numb at 20 minutes and she kept walking because stopping was not an option, because she had made a decision, and she was in it now, and the only direction was forward, even when forward looked like nothing but white and dark and wind. She was not thinking about the ranch anymore. She was thinking about the ground under her feet, and the distance to the creek she'd crossed on the wagon road, which she remembered was roughly 2 miles from the gate. And after the creek there was a rise, and after the rise there should be the junction with the main road, and possibly, the Briggs farm that sat a half-mile east of the junction where she could shelter. She was thinking very hard about these practical things when she stopped being able to see the road at all. She stopped walking and stood in the white dark and turned in a slow circle and could not tell which direction she'd come from. The wind was coming from everywhere. The snow had erased the road entirely, and she was standing in what might have been a field or might have been the road, and she could not see a single landmark, no fence line, no tree, no light from any building. She was lost. She stood there and let herself understand this. She was lost in a Wyoming snowstorm with a trunk she could no longer feel her fingers enough to grip properly, and she was 20 miles from town and nobody knew she'd left. She set the trunk down in the snow. She sat on it. She sat there in the white dark and the wind and told herself to think, just think, work the problem the way she'd worked every problem in this house, methodically. From what she knew toward what she needed. She knew there was a creek. She knew the creek ran south to north somewhere to her east. If she could find the creek, she could follow it north and eventually reach the main road. She could hear water, she thought, somewhere to her right. A sound under the wind, low and continuous. She stood up, leaving the trunk. She couldn't take it anymore. She was losing heat carrying it, and walked toward the sound. The ground sloped downward. She felt it under her feet and slowed. The snow was deeper here, above her ankles, and the wind was cut slightly by a depression in the land. She could hear the creek more clearly now, somewhere below her, and she was trying to find a way down the bank that wasn't a drop when her foot went out from under her on ice. She caught herself on one hand and one knee in the snow, and when she tried to stand back up, her legs were slower than they should have been and colder than she'd registered, and she understood that she'd been in the cold longer than she'd thought, and her body had been spending resources on staying warm that it hadn't announced spending. She got to her feet. She found the edge of the creek bank with her hands, frozen ground over ice, the water moving black and fast below in the small visible gap where the snow had drifted off the bank. She crouched there and tried to think, and found the thinking harder than it had been 10 minutes ago, which told her something she didn't want to know about her current situation. She pulled her coat tighter. She stayed very still in the curve of the bank, where the wind was slightly less, and tried to think clearly about what she could do and what she couldn't, and what the options were from here, and whether any of them led somewhere that wasn't this frozen creek bank in a Wyoming blizzard. Behind her, somewhere in the white distance, there was a sound, something that wasn't wind. She raised her head. It was a horse. She couldn't see it. She could hear it. The particular sound of a horse moving fast in snow, hooves muffled, the creak of tack. And then a voice, cutting across the wind, not close, but not far. "Evelyn." She opened her mouth and her throat did something that wasn't quite working right. She tried again. "Here," she said. Then, louder, pushing the sound against the wind. "Here!" The horse sound changed direction. She could hear it getting closer, and then the shape of a rider materialized out of the white, dark against dark, resolving into something she recognized, the angle of the shoulders, the way he sat a horse like he'd been doing it since before he had to think about it. Caleb pulled up 10 feet from her and was off the horse in one motion and across the snow, and she sat in the curve of the bank and watched him come and felt nothing in her hands and felt everything in her chest. He stopped 2 feet in front of her and looked at her, coat, no hat, hands bare, sitting on the creek bank in a blizzard, and she could not read his face in the dark and the snow, which was fine because she was done trying to read his face. "You're going to lose fingers," he said. "I'm aware," she said. He pulled off his gloves and took her hands and wrapped them in his, and the warmth of that was so abrupt it was almost painful. She didn't pull away. She also didn't say anything. "How long have you been out here?" he said. "I don't know, 40 minutes, maybe an hour." He said something under his breath that she didn't catch and probably wasn't meant for her. He kept her hands in his and looked at her face in the dark. "You left," he said. "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him. The snow was in his hair and on his coat, and he'd come out into a blizzard on a horse without his gloves, and she was sitting on a frozen creek bank, and she was done managing what she said and what she didn't say. "Because I heard you," she said, "in the barn, tonight. What you told that man." He went very still. "She's not what Clara was," she said. "Not cruel about it, not performing it, just saying it back to him the way it had been said. She's not going to be. That's not what this is." She pulled her hands back from his and put them in her coat pockets. "I know that. I've always known that. I just can't keep pretending I don't hear it." The wind moved between them. The snow came down. He was looking at her, and she could not read his face, and she had stopped needing to. "I'm not asking you to come back tonight for your sake," she said. "I'm asking you to come back because you'll die out here," he said. And his voice had something in it she'd never heard before, something cracked through the middle. "Evelyn, please." She sat in the snow and listened to the word please in his voice, which she had never heard in 4 months, and she thought about Eli on the porch steps, and Rosie's rag doll, and the damper note, and the bread, and the long Wyoming winter she had survived one cold morning at a time. She thought about all of it. Then she got up. He helped her onto his horse, and he climbed up behind her and turned back toward the ranch, and she sat in front of him with his coat around both of them, against the wind. And neither of them spoke, and the house came into view through the snow. The kitchen lamp still burning, the barn light still on, and on the porch, 3 small shapes she could see even in the dark and the distance. Rosie, Eli, Micah, all 3 of them standing on the porch in the cold, waiting. She felt Caleb's arm tighten around her, just slightly, involuntary, the way a person's grip tightened when they realized how close they'd come to losing something. And she sat in that and didn't say a word, and the horse carried them home through the last of the storm. The porch steps were icy, and Micah came down them fast to help with the horse, taking the reins without being asked, and Rosie was crying in the particular silent way she had when she was trying not to. Face wet, mouth pressed tight, arms crossed over her chest like she was holding herself together. Eli stood behind her with his good arm around her shoulders, and his face doing something complicated that he was also trying not to show. Evelyn got down from the horse, and her legs were not fully reliable under her, and she put her hand on the fence post and stood there for a moment. Just stood, letting the ground be solid and the wind be at her back instead of in her face. Rosie crossed the yard in 4 steps and put her arms around Evelyn's waist and pressed her face into her coat and didn't say anything at all. Evelyn put her arms around the girl and held on. "All right," she said quietly. "All right. I'm here." She didn't say I'm fine because she wasn't, and Rosie was 6 years old but not foolish. And saying things that weren't true to children to make them feel better was a practice Evelyn had avoided from the beginning because children learned fast what your words were worth. She said I'm here because that was simply and entirely true. Micah had taken the horse to the barn, and Caleb had gone with him, which left Evelyn on the porch with the 2 younger children, and she steered Rosie back up the steps and inside, her hand on the girl's back, Eli following close. The kitchen was warm. Someone had fed the stove while she was gone. She could tell from the heat of it. And she sat Rosie at the table and poured water to heat, and began the practical business of getting herself back to functional, which meant getting warm in an order that made sense. Hands first, then feet, then everything else. She wrapped her hands around the cup of water she'd heated and held it while feeling came back in the painful, prickling way it did, and she breathed through it and didn't make noise about it. Eli sat across from her. "Where were you going?" he said. "Eli," Rosie said sharply, which was the voice of a 6-year-old who had decided that now was not the time. "It's a reasonable question," Eli said, but he said it more quietly. Evelyn looked at him. His face was older than 10 in this light. It was always older than 10 in this light. This boy who'd been watching and calculating since before he should have had to. "I was going to town," she said. "It's 20 miles. "I know." "In a blizzard." "I know that too." He looked at her for a long moment. He was doing the math she could see, the assessment that came out the other side as a question he was deciding whether to ask. He decided not to ask it. "The biscuits from supper are on the stove," he said instead. "They're still warm if you want them." She looked at him, this boy who'd asked her 3 days ago if she was planning to stay, and who was now offering her biscuits as the most direct form of reassurance he had available to him. And she felt the particular ache of it low in her chest. "Thank you," she said. She ate. She got warm. She put Rosie to bed, which took longer than usual because Rosie wanted to be held for a while, and Evelyn sat on the edge of the cot and held her and said nothing in particular while the girl's breathing gradually settled from the uneven rhythm of suppressed crying into something slower and easier. When she came back to the kitchen, Caleb was there. He was sitting at the table where she'd sat, his hands around a cup of coffee, not drinking it. His coat was still on. He hadn't taken his boots off. He looked like a man who'd come inside for a specific purpose and hadn't yet decided whether to proceed with it. She put another piece of wood in the stove. She poured herself the last of the coffee and sat at the far end of the table and looked at the table rather than at him, and the silence was different from all the other silences they'd shared. Thicker and warmer and considerably more dangerous. He said, "I didn't hear you." She looked up. "In the barn. I didn't know you were there." He was still looking at his coffee. "What I said to Tom Briggs. I didn't know you heard it." "It wouldn't have been different if you'd known I was listening." He was quiet for long enough that she thought that might be the whole of it, that he'd say the reasonable limiting thing and leave the table and they'd go back to the maintenance version of their arrangement, which she now knew she couldn't sustain. But he didn't say the reasonable thing. He said, "I don't know what I would have said. That's the honest answer. I don't know." She waited. "What I told Tom was—" He stopped, turned the cup in his hands. "Tom Briggs has been widowed twice and married 3 times, and he has opinions about women and arrangements and what things are for, and I—" Another stop. He was working at something. She could see it. Working at something that wasn't used to being worked at. I said it so he'd stop asking questions, because the questions he was asking were ones I didn't have answers to, and I don't do well with things I don't have answers to. What questions was he asking? He looked up at her then, direct, without the management. Whether I was getting attached. The word hung in the kitchen air. She could hear the stove and the wind and nothing else. "And what did you tell him?" she said. "I told him what I told you, that it was convenient, that it was an arrangement." He set the cup down. "I was lying." She sat with that. "I've been lying for about 6 weeks," he said, "possibly longer. I don't know when it started, so I don't know exactly how long I've been doing it." She looked at him across the table. He looked like a man who had just put down something very heavy and wasn't sure his arms remembered how to hang normally without it. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "What are you saying to me right now?" He pushed back from the table and stood up, which for a moment she thought meant he was leaving, that he'd gotten to the edge of the thing and backed off it. But he didn't leave. He went to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark and the snow. And she waited. "Clara died in November," he said, 14 months ago. "She was sick for 6 weeks before that, and I knew around the 4th week that she wasn't going to get better, and I went somewhere in my head. Micah told you about that, going into the blizzard. He told me. I never came back out." His voice was flat, not flat from distance, but flat from weight. "I kept the ranch going, kept the children fed and clothed and in school, managed everything that needed managing, but I went small, inside. I made myself small enough that nothing could reach me, and I stayed there, and I told myself that was what surviving looked like." She didn't say anything. "When Gerald Carter wrote to me about you, I said yes because the ranch needed someone, and I didn't have anyone, and it seemed like the practical thing." He turned from the window. "And you got here, and you were 18 years old, and you looked at my house like you were cataloging everything wrong with it, and I thought, well, she's not going to last 2 weeks. Is that what you thought?" "I also thought—" He stopped, put his hand against the wall. "I thought you had the steadiest eyes I'd ever seen on someone who was probably terrified." She looked at him. "You were terrified," he said. "I could see it, but you walked in that door and you looked at the stove and you asked what your responsibilities were, and I didn't know what to do with that. So I did what I always do, which is nothing. I put my head down and I kept the distance, and I told myself it was an arrangement, just an arrangement, and I would be careful not to let it be anything else because anything else could be taken away." The words sat between them. Plain and without decoration, the way hard things were when the person saying them was too tired to dress them up. "I know what it feels like," Evelyn said carefully, "to be taken away from, to have things removed before you could decide whether to hold on to them." He nodded, once. But Caleb, she kept her voice even, not gentle, exactly. Real. Saying I'm an arrangement to Tom Briggs in the barn at midnight while I'm standing outside the door in the cold, that's not being careful. She thought about the word she wanted. That's what a person does when they've decided to be afraid forever. He looked at her for a long moment. Yeah, he said. I know. The snow had stopped, she realized. Sometime in the last few minutes, the sound of it against the windows had gone quiet. The kitchen held the hush of a house after a storm. Everything slightly held breath, slightly surprised to still be standing. I'm not asking you to be in love with me, she said. I'm not asking for something you don't have. I'm asking you to stop deciding in advance what I am and what I'm worth and what this can and can't be. Because I've been decided about my whole life, and I'm done with it. He stood against the wall and she sat at the table, and they looked at each other in the quiet kitchen. That's fair, he said. I know it's fair. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. Not a smile, not relief, something in between, something that was the expression of a person who has been walking in one direction for a very long time and has just turned around. The children would have... He stopped, started differently. When Micah found your note on the table, he didn't say anything. He just put on his coat and went outside, and I heard him from the barn. And that's... I've never heard him. He stopped again. I know, she said. Rosie sat on the porch steps in the snow. Caleb. He looked at her. Come sit down, she said. He came and sat down, across the table from her, closer than he usually sat, close enough that she could see the frost that was still in his hair from the ride out. He looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at her. I'm sorry, he said, for what I said, and for how long I said nothing that I should have said. Don't apologize to me with a list, she said. That's not what this needs. What does it need? She thought about it, genuinely considered, not performing consideration. It needs you to stop being so afraid of me, she said. He looked at that for a moment, then quietly, that might take some practice. I have time, she said. Then, she did not move back into the house that night, so much as simply not leave it. There was no grand gesture of return, no formal recommencement of the arrangement. She just stayed because she was there, and the stove was warm, and she was too tired and too cold and too much still in the middle of something to do anything else. She slept better than she had in weeks. She wasn't sure what that meant and didn't analyze it. The morning was the morning. Stove, bread, the house coming awake in its particular order. Rosie appearing first, as always, then Eli with his arms still strapped, then Micah from the barn where he'd apparently gone before dawn to check the stock after the storm. Caleb was last, which was unusual, and when he came into the kitchen, he looked like a man who hadn't slept much but wasn't unhappy about the reason. He looked at her across the kitchen. She looked back. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be said. Not yet. Not in front of the children who were having their breakfast and conducting the morning's small business of spillage and argument and the particular ongoing dispute between Eli and Rosie about who had borrowed whose pencil. But Micah, pouring coffee at the stove, glanced at Evelyn and then at his father and then back at the coffee. And he didn't say anything either, but the set of his shoulders was different from how it had been yesterday. Less braced, less carrying. She noticed it because she'd learned to read him, and what it said was that something had been resolved or at least had moved toward resolution, and that was enough for now. Enough for now was a thing she'd come to understand as distinct from enough for good. She held the distinction carefully. The April thaw that came after the last storm came properly this time, as though the blizzard had been winter's final argument, and having made it, the season was satisfied. The temperature climbed steadily through the last week of April into May, and with the warmth the ranch came back to life in the practical sense. More work, longer days, the specific urgencies of spring on a cattle operation that required everyone's full attention and then some. She didn't have long conversations with Caleb. They didn't have the time, and she wasn't sure either of them were ready for long conversations, which had the potential to go wrong in ways that short conversations didn't. What they had were the short ones. The kitchen morning exchanges, the supper table, the occasional practical consultation about the house or the children or the supply situation. And those were different now, changed in a way she could feel but couldn't fully describe. He asked her things. That was the main change. Before, he'd issued information when information was necessary and otherwise operated within his own sphere without reference to her opinions. Now he asked, "What do you think about pulling the east fence before it floods again? Eli's been asking about town school in the fall. What's your read on whether he's ready?" Martha Henderson sent a note, something about the lending library expanding. You might want to look at it. Small questions, practical questions, but questions that assumed she had a perspective worth incorporating, that operated from the premise that she was a participant in the running of this place rather than a resource deployed within it. She answered them. She asked some back. They built a thing that was careful and incremental, and not at all like what the novels she'd read as a girl had suggested marriage ought to feel like. And she found that she didn't mind. The novels had not been notably accurate about Wyoming winters either. One evening in early May, Caleb came in from the south field after dark. Later than he'd meant to, she could tell from the way he moved, the particular combination of tired and slightly apologetic that she'd learned to read. And she had a plate warming on the stove for him, which she'd started doing without deciding to do it, and he sat at the table and ate while she finished the evening's mending and the house settled around them. After a while he said, "Clara's sister wrote." She looked up. "From Illinois. She writes twice a year. I wrote back after Clara passed, and she's been good about it, about the children." He pushed the plate aside. "She wants to know about the children." "What did you tell her?" "I haven't answered yet. I was thinking about what to say." He looked at the table. "I thought I'd ask if you had thoughts about it. About what to say about how things are." She considered this. "You could tell her the truth," she said, "that the children are well, that the house is being managed, that you have someone you—" She paused, chose. "Someone you trust looking after them." He looked at her when she said trust. The word sat between them. "Is that what you are?" he said. Not a challenge, genuinely asking. "I think so," she said. "I think that's what we've been building up to." He nodded slowly. "That's what I'll tell her then." He wrote the letter that night, at the table, in his precise, practical handwriting, while she finished the mending and the lamp burned between them, and she did not read over his shoulder, but she heard the scratch of the pen and the occasional pause when he was thinking. And it was an ordinary evening by every measure, and it was also, quietly, something more than ordinary. The conversation she'd been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting for it, happened on a Sunday afternoon in the third week of May, when the work was slightly less relentless than usual and the weather was warm enough that the children had gone out without argument and the house was quiet. She was in the kitchen. Caleb came in from the yard and stood in the doorway for a moment, the way he sometimes did when he was thinking, and then he came and sat at the table. "I need to tell you something," he said. She put down what she was doing. "About Clara." He looked at his hands, then at her. "I need you to understand. You said that night that I was deciding in advance what you are and what you're worth. You were right. I know you were right, but I need you to understand why, because I don't think you fully do." She waited. She was the kind of person you build your whole understanding of the world around, he said. "From the time I was 20 years old, everything I thought I knew about what life was supposed to be came through her. And when she died, I didn't just lose her, I lost the whole framework, everything that had organized the world." He paused. "I went into the blizzard because coming out of the blizzard meant having to rebuild all of that from nothing, and I didn't know how, and I was 50% sure I didn't want to." "And the other 50%, she said. "The children," he said simply. She nodded. "When you came here," he stopped. "When you started to matter, I couldn't. I didn't know how to let something matter without the whole framework. I didn't know how to do it partially. I'd never done it. Clara was everything or nothing. That was how we were, and I didn't know how to do a different version of that." "So you made me nothing," she said. He winced. "Yes. Because the alternative was something you didn't know how to do." "Yes." He looked at her. "I know what that cost you. I know what it was like to be in that house and feel like an arrangement," she said. "Yes." She looked at the table for a moment. She thought about the girl who'd arrived in January with a trunk and a good coat and the steadiest eyes she could manage, and she thought about what that girl had needed and hadn't gotten, and she felt the residue of it, real, not gone, not something she was going to pretend wasn't there. "I'm not asking you to stop loving her," Evelyn said. "Clara, I'm not asking for you to forget that or put it aside, or I know that's not possible and I wouldn't ask it." "I know," he said, "but I need—" She paused, got the words right. "I need to know that there's room, that what's here, what we've built, the children and the house and what's between us, whatever it is, I need to know it has somewhere to exist that isn't borrowed space, that isn't provisional." He was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet she'd learned wasn't emptiness. "I think you've earned more than borrowed space," he said finally. "I think you've been building your own room in this house since January, and I just kept pretending I didn't see it." He looked at her steadily. "I see it." She breathed in, breathed out. "I need you to know something too," she said. He waited. "I wasn't here because I had nowhere else to go." She looked at him directly. "I stayed because I chose to, because these children are, because this is real to me. Not an obligation, not an endurance. I want you to know the difference." Something shifted in his face. Not the controlled shifting she'd learned to read over months. Something larger, less managed, the kind of movement that happened when a person's defenses came down, not because they'd decided to lower them, but because something had gotten through anyway. "I know the difference," he said quietly. "I've known it for a while. That's what scared me." She looked at him across the table. This man who'd been in a blizzard for 14 months, who'd handed her damper instructions under the kitchen door instead of saying thank you, who'd ridden into a Wyoming snowstorm without his gloves to find her. And she thought that whatever they were building, it was made of the actual materials of their lives rather than anything easier, and that meant it would probably hold. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. That was what it looked like, the turning point between them. No grand declaration, no single moment that rewrote everything before it. Just two people at a kitchen table saying all right to each other, which contained everything they'd come through and everything they were starting, and which was enough to go on. The weeks that followed were not without difficulty. She would not say they were without difficulty because she'd committed to accuracy about this place and these people. And accuracy required acknowledging that Caleb Ward did not become easy to live with overnight, and she did not become uncomplicated, and the children did not stop being themselves, which meant various varieties of chaos. Eli's shoulder healed, and he celebrated this by immediately overusing it in the barn and re-injuring it mildly, which meant another 2 weeks of strapping and another extended period of being confined to light duties that he expressed his feelings about comprehensively and without restraint. Rosie went through a phase in May of refusing to eat anything that was touching anything else on her plate, which was not a new characteristic exactly, but was more extreme than usual and required a level of plating creativity that Evelyn found genuinely exhausting. Micah, who had softened in his incremental way through the spring, had a reversal in mid-May for reasons that she suspected had to do with a boy in town and a humiliation he hadn't told anyone about, and went back to his walls for about a week before gradually coming back out. None of it was smooth. None of it was the version of a family that appeared in the stories where everything resolved neatly. It was the version where people were tired and imperfect and sometimes said the wrong thing and had to come back the next day and try again, and that was what she had, and she'd take it. She and Caleb moved toward each other in the way that people did when they'd both been keeping careful distance and had decided cautiously to stop. Slowly, with occasional hesitations, nothing like the romance of novels, but something that had its own weight and its own texture. He sat closer at the table. He told her things without being asked, about the ranch, about his thinking on the fall cattle sales, about a letter from an old friend in Colorado that he'd read aloud to her one evening without quite explaining why he wanted to. She told him things too, about her parents, eventually, not all at once, in installments, the way she'd always found easier. Her mother saying about how things broke and how to put them back together. Her father's hands, what she remembered of them. The years with Gerald and what they'd cost her, and what, unexpectedly, they'd taught her about being resourceful. He listened the way he did everything, quietly, thoroughly, without a lot of visible response that nonetheless accumulated into something that told her he'd held on to what she'd said. One evening, he came in from the barn and put a small package on the table next to where she was working, wrapped in cloth, tied with a piece of cord. He sat down and didn't say anything. She looked at the package and then at him. "Open it," he said. Inside was a small compass, brass, old, the face worn smooth where someone had handled it for years. She turned it in her hands. "It was my father's," he said. "He came out here with nothing but a horse and that compass, and he used to say as long as you knew which way was north, you could find your way to anywhere else." He looked at it in her hands. "I thought about giving it to Micah for years, but I don't think Micah is the one who needs to know which direction is north." She looked at the compass. The needle turned and settled. "Caleb," she said. "You said you needed something that wasn't borrowed space," he said. "This is—" He paused. "I'm not saying it's enough. I know it's not enough, but it's mine and I'm giving it to you, and I wanted you to have something that made that concrete." She closed her hand around the compass. She looked at him. "It's enough for now," she said. "That's enough." He nodded. He reached across the table and put his hand over her closed fist. Just for a moment, just briefly, the way a person touched something they were deciding they were allowed to touch. And then he pulled his hand back and looked at the table. She kept the compass. She kept it in her apron pocket, and she took it out sometimes when she was working and held it in her palm and felt the weight of it. And once Rosie asked what it was, and Evelyn showed her how the needle always found north, no matter how you turned it, and Rosie turned it round and round with wide eyes, watching the needle swing and settle, swing and settle. "It always comes back," Rosie said. "It always comes back," Evelyn agreed. She did not see it coming the way it arrived. Nothing in the weeks of careful, incremental rebuilding had prepared her for the morning in late May when Micah came to the back door and said, "There's a man in the yard asking for you," with a look on his face that told her the man was someone he didn't recognize and didn't particularly trust. She dried her hands. She went to the door. Gerald Carter was standing in the yard. He looked older. She registered this first before anything else. The way a season away from someone revealed the changes that proximity had hidden. His hair was more gray than it had been. He held his hat in his hands, which she had never once seen him do. He was standing in the middle of the yard like a man who wasn't sure he had the right to come closer, which was also something she had never seen from him. She stood on the porch and looked at him. "Evelyn," he said. "Uncle Gerald," she said. She kept her voice even. She kept everything even. "I came—" He stopped, looked at the hat in his hands. "I heard you were settling in well." "Who told you that?" "Martha Henderson. She wrote to Meredith." "Of course. The sewing circle." She filed this away without reaction. "And Meredith told you," she said. "She did." He looked up at her. "She told me you were doing well, that the children were— that you were doing well." Evelyn stood on the porch and looked at her uncle, who had given her away for a debt settlement and had not come outside to see her off, and she considered what she felt. She had expected, on some imaginary future occasion when she thought about it, to feel a cold version of anger, the contained, purposeful kind that she'd been carrying since January and had gotten very used to. But standing here with Gerald in the yard looking smaller than she remembered, what she actually felt was more complicated, less clean than anger. "Why did you come?" she said. He turned the hat once in his hands. "I thought— I needed to see it was all right, that you were all right." "You didn't think about that in January." "No," he said. "I didn't." She looked at him. She was not going to make this easy for him. She also was not going to perform bitterness for its own sake, because that was about him and she was done organizing herself around him. "I'm all right," she said. "You can see that." "I can." He was quiet for a moment. "Evelyn, I know there's nothing— I know what I did isn't something I can just—" "No," she said. "It's not." He nodded. He looked at the house, at the porch, the windows, the small signs of a maintained and functioning household. "She did that," Micah said from behind her. She turned. He was standing in the doorway, arms not crossed for once, just standing, watching Gerald with the level gaze he turned on things he was assessing. "The house," Micah said to Gerald. "She did all of it, in case you were wondering." Gerald looked at Micah and then at Evelyn. "I know," he said quietly. Caleb appeared around the side of the barn then. She saw him notice the visitor and change direction, coming toward the house with the unhurried pace of a man who owned the ground he was walking on and had questions about what was on it. He came to the porch and stopped beside Evelyn and looked at Gerald. "Caleb Ward," he said. "Not unfriendly, not the opposite." "Gerald Carter." A pause. "Her uncle." Caleb looked at Gerald for a moment with an expression she couldn't read from the side. Then he said, "You'll stay for supper if you've come this far." It was not warm, exactly. It was the offer of a man who had been raised to offer it and who was making a calculation at the same time, a calculation that included Evelyn, that deferred to her without quite making the deference explicit. She looked at Caleb. He looked at her. She looked back at Gerald. "You can stay for supper," she said. "After that, we'll see." Gerald nodded. He put his hat back on. He looked at her with something on his face that wasn't quite enough and wasn't quite nothing, and she thought that this was how it was. That forgiveness wasn't a door that opened all the way at once. That it was a thing that either happened slowly over time or didn't happen, and she wasn't going to decide today which one this was going to be. She went inside to start supper. She heard Caleb behind her saying something to Gerald in a low voice, something practical, about putting his horse in the barn, about the weather. And she heard Gerald answering, and she listened to the two voices from the kitchen, and she thought about what it meant that Caleb had made the offer. She thought about a lot of things while she made supper, about the gap between who people were and who they had the potential to become, and how you could never be sure in advance which one you were dealing with, about the work of staying angry and the work of letting go, and how neither one was easy, and the choice between them was its own kind of labor, about a kitchen that had been cold in January and was warm now in late May, and about how warmth in a house was not one thing, but many things accumulated. The stove, yes, but also the bread, and the laughter she'd started to hear sometimes from the yard when the children were outside, and the compass in her apron pocket, and the note about the damper that she still had, folded in the bottom of her trunk. Rosie came in and leaned against the counter and watched her cook. "Who's the man?" she asked. "My uncle," Evelyn said. "He came to visit." Rosie considered this. "Is he nice?" Evelyn thought about the honest answer. "He's trying to be," she said. "I think that counts for something." Rosie appeared to accept this as reasonable and climbed onto her stool and started peeling the potatoes without being asked, which was something she'd started doing in March, and which still, every time, produced a small warm thing in Evelyn's chest that she'd stopped trying to name. She cooked. Rosie peeled. Outside she could hear Eli's voice, and Caleb's voice, and Gerald's voice in the yard, some discussion about the fence line from the sound of it, the practical currency of men who didn't know how to talk to each other yet, and defaulted to property. She put the potatoes on and started on the biscuits, and the kitchen filled with the smell of it, heat and flour, and the particular smell of a house that was being lived in, which was different from a house that was just being kept. And she thought that she had arrived here 4 months ago as a transaction, and she was still here, and the transaction had turned into something that she didn't have a clean name for, but which was real, and was hers. And hers was enough. More than enough. The biscuits went in the oven, and she stood at the stove and listened to the house around her. The voices outside. Rosie humming something low and tuneless on her stool. The particular creak of the third floorboard when someone was walking in the hallway above, and she felt the weight of the compass in her pocket, and she thought, north. There it is. And everything else from here. Gerald stayed 3 days. It was not comfortable, exactly. Comfort was not something that rebuilt itself in 3 days after 9 years of a certain kind of damage. But it was real, which was its own category. He ate at the table and helped with the fence work Caleb put him to without complaint. And in the evenings he sat on the porch with his hat in his hands and said little, which was the most honest version of him she'd ever seen. The performative certainty he'd always carried, the flatness that had read his authority, was gone, or at least diminished, and what was underneath was just an old man who had made choices that could not be unmade and was trying to figure out what came after the understanding of that. On the second evening, Evelyn sat with him on the porch, not because she'd decided to forgive him. She hadn't decided that, not fully, and she wasn't going to pretend she had, but because she was trying to be honest about what was in front of her rather than what she'd expected, And what was in front of her was a man who had come 40 miles to see if she was all right, and that was not nothing, even if it was very late. Meredith wanted to come, he said. You should have let her. I know. He looked at the yard. I thought it should be me first. She considered that. It was the most accountable thing she'd ever heard him say, and she registered it without making too much of it. She can come in the fall, Evelyn said, when the roads are better. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that she chose not to look at too directly. All right, he said. When he left on the third morning, Caleb shook his hand and Micah nodded from a distance and Eli waved cheerfully because Eli was constitutionally incapable of holding grudges he hadn't personally earned, and Rosie gave Gerald one of the small wildflowers she'd been collecting from the yard all week, pressed into his palm with the solemnity of a child bestowing something precious. He looked at the flower for a long moment before he put it carefully in his breast pocket. Evelyn stood on the porch and watched the wagon go and felt the complicated residue of it. Not resolution, not exactly, but the beginning of a longer process that might eventually become one. You couldn't undo what people had done to you. You could decide what kind of room it occupied going forward. She was still deciding. She went inside and fed the starter and started the bread. What? June arrived, and with it the valley came alive in the way that Wyoming summers did when they finally committed. Sudden and vivid and almost aggressively beautiful after the long months of gray and white. The grass came up green and thick in the south pasture. The creek ran clear and fast with snowmelt from the high country, and the wildflowers appeared in the low ground by the eastern fence line, in colors that seemed improbable after winter, like the land was overcompensating. It was Caleb who took her there. A Sunday afternoon, the children occupied, Micah in the barn, Eli at the Henderson boys' place, Rosie asleep over a book. And Caleb came to the kitchen doorway and said, "Come with me," with the manner of a man who had been working up to something for a week and had decided to stop working up to it. She dried her hands and went. He took her east on horseback, through the fence gate and across the pasture and down into the low ground she'd only seen from a distance. And when they came through the last stand of cottonwood, the valley opened up in front of her. An acre of wildflowers, maybe more, yellow and purple and white, moving in the light wind off the hills. The creek running along the eastern edge, catching the afternoon sun in pieces. She pulled up and looked at it. Clara found this in our first summer here, Caleb said beside her. She used to come out alone sometimes. Said it was the one place on the property that looked like it didn't need anything from her. He was looking at the valley, not at her. I haven't been back since she died. She understood what it meant that he'd brought her here. She didn't make him say it. It's beautiful, she said, simply, because it was. I know. He reached into his coat pocket and held something out to her. She looked at it. A string of pearls, small and imperfect, slightly irregular in their spacing, the kind that had been worn and handled for years rather than kept in a box. She knew without asking that they'd been Clara's. I'm not giving them to you because they were hers, he said. I'm giving them to you because they've been in my coat pocket for 3 weeks, and I couldn't figure out how to give you something that was actually worth giving. He paused. These are the best thing I have. She looked at the pearls in his hand for a long moment. She thought about what it meant to receive something that held someone else's history, whether it was a weight or an offering, a displacement or an inclusion. She thought about Rosie's rag doll named Clara and what the girl had said. I think she likes you. She thought about a woman who had built a crooked barn stall on purpose and had thoughts about Thursdays and had died too fast, and who was present in this valley and in the compass she carried, and in the eyes of 3 children who were, in ways she hadn't planned and couldn't fully account for, hers now. She held out her hand. He put the pearls in her palm. She closed her fingers around them. I'm not replacing her, she said. I know that. I'm just here. That's what I am. I'm the person who's here. You're more than that, he said. I know that too. She looked at him across the short distance between the horses, this careful, difficult, genuinely trying man, and she thought that love, when it came in real life rather than in stories, looked nothing like the stories said it would. It looked like damper instructions under a door. It looked like a compass. It looked like a man who had been in a blizzard for 14 months choosing, finally, to come in from the cold. Not all at once and not without stumbling, but moving in the right direction. She thought that was enough, more than enough. All right, she said. "All right," he said, which was what they said when they meant considerably more than the words contained. The wedding was in this wildflower valley on a Saturday in late June, which had been Rosie's suggestion, stated with the authority of a 6-year-old who had decided how things should be and saw no reason for negotiation. Evelyn had agreed immediately, and Caleb had looked at his daughter and said, "That'll work." And the matter was settled with more efficiency than most things. It was small. Martha Henderson came, and Doc Morrow and Tom Briggs with his current wife, and a few others from town who had watched this household from a distance through the winter and the spring, and had been tracking its status with the attentive interest of a community that cared about its members, even when it expressed that care mostly through observation. The justice of the peace from Delmore read the necessary words in the afternoon light, with the wind moving the wildflowers around his boots. Evelyn wore her good coat over a dress that Martha Henderson had helped her alter from a bolt of blue fabric she'd bought on credit in town, and Rosie had put wildflowers in her hair, slightly lopsided, because Rosie's reach was limited and her ambition was not. And she had stood in the valley and said the words and felt the weight of them without trying to make them lighter or heavier than they were. Micah stood beside his father with his good shirt on and his hair combed back with more effort than he would admit, and he looked at Evelyn during the ceremony with the level, measuring gaze she knew well. And at the end of it, when it was done and people were moving and talking, he came to stand beside her. "I meant what I told you in the barn," he said, "last fall, about what my father is." "I know you did," she said. "I just wanted you to know I still mean it." He looked at the valley. "And I'm glad you're staying." It was the most direct thing he had ever said to her. She received it carefully and did not make too much of it, and said, "I'm glad I'm staying too," which was the most direct true thing she could say in return. Eli celebrated by eating an unreasonable amount of the food Martha Henderson had brought, and then falling asleep against a cottonwood with the boneless ease of a 10-year-old, and nobody woke him for an hour. What came after was not the end of difficulty. She knew better than to expect that, and she was glad she knew better, because the summer brought its own variety of trouble. A drought in July that threatened the south pasture, a dispute with a neighboring rancher over water rights that took 3 weeks and 2 visits to the land office in Delmore to resolve. Micah's ongoing and eventually successful attempt to court a girl in town that caused enough household disruption to constitute a minor weather event. None of it was smooth. All of it was real. And in August, on a Tuesday morning, when the light came in early through the kitchen window, and the starter was fed, and the bread was in the oven, and the house was still quiet, Evelyn stood at the kitchen counter and held a particular knowledge in her body that she'd been holding for 3 weeks and had been turning over carefully, like something fragile that needed examining from all sides before you knew how to carry it. She was going to have a child. She stood in the morning kitchen and held this knowledge and felt the full weight of it. Not the fear, not first, though the fear was present. First she felt something that was bigger than fear and more complicated, something that expanded into all the corners of her and didn't leave room for anything smaller. She told Caleb that evening, after supper, after the children were in bed, in the kitchen that had become the room where they said true things to each other. She told him plainly because that was how she did everything. He was still for a long moment. Then he put his hands on the table and looked at them, and she watched something move through him. She could see it, the sequence of it, the impact and the adjustment, and whatever came out the other side of both. He looked up. "Are you well?" he said. "First." She noticed that. "First." "I'm well," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. Not briefly, not the way he'd touched her fist over the compass, but held it, deliberately, the way you held something you understood the value of. "All right," he said, and his voice had something in it she'd never heard before. Cracked through in a different place than the other times, softer, something that had been held back for a very long time, finally allowed forward. "All right," she said. Bam. The rain came in September, the long, slow rain of a Wyoming autumn that settled in for days and turned the yard soft and made everything smell like wet earth and possibility. Evelyn stood on the porch in it one afternoon while the children were inside, Rosie at her lessons, Eli and Micah somewhere in the barn, and she watched the rain come down across the valley and thought about the year. January to September, 8 months. She'd arrived with a trunk and a good coat and the steadiest eyes she could manage, And she was standing here now with a child beginning inside her, and a compass in her pocket, and the smell of her own bread coming through the kitchen door. And the distance between those 2 points was not a smooth arc. It was the actual shape of things, jagged and circling back on itself, and full of the kinds of wrong turns that left marks. And she would not pretty it up, because it didn't need to be prettied up. It had happened the way it happened, and she was still here. Caleb came around the side of the house from the barn and stopped when he saw her standing in the rain and said, "What are you doing?" "Standing in the rain," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to read as affection wearing practical clothing. He came up the porch steps and stood beside her. "It's cold," he said. "I know." He stood there with her anyway. They looked at the rain across the valley, the grass going gold at the edges, the cottonwoods beginning to turn. Somewhere inside the house, Rosie laughed at something, a clear, high sound that came through the window. "We should plant something," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Something permanent," she said. "That'll still be here in 20 years. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "East side of the house gets the most sun," he said. "Ground's deep enough there." "What would grow?" "Elm, maybe. Oak, if you're patient." A pause. "I have an oak seedling in the barn. Started it in spring from the acorn. I was going to see what happened to it." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the yard with the particular expression of someone who'd been carrying an intention without quite knowing what to do with it, and she thought, 8 months, and he still surprised her. And she was glad of that, because people who stopped surprising you had stopped being fully present, and fully present was what she wanted. Fully present, imperfect, real. "Let's plant the oak," she said. They went inside. They got the children, all 3 of them, Rosie from her lessons, and Eli from whatever he was doing in the barn that involved considerably more noise than could be accounted for, and Micah, who came when called without a question and took the small oak seedling from Caleb's hands and carried it to the east side of the house like he'd been asked to carry something important, because he understood that he had been. They dug the hole together in the rain. The ground was soft, and it was not difficult, but they did it together anyway. Caleb with the heavy digging, Eli insisting on a turn, Rosie crouched at the edge of the hole watching with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered. Micah set the seedling in the ground and held it straight while Caleb filled the earth back in around it, and they all stood there in the September rain looking at the small wet thing in the ground that was at this moment barely more than a stick. "It won't be much for years," Caleb said. "I know," Evelyn said. "Oaks are slow." "I know that too." Rosie looked up at her. "Will it be big when the baby comes?" "Not yet," Evelyn said, "but it'll be here." Rosie seemed to find this satisfactory. She put her hand on the small trunk, barely thicker than her wrist, with a careful, considering touch, the same way she touched things she intended to take care of. The rain came down on all of them, and nobody moved to go inside, not yet, and Evelyn stood in the wet grass beside the oak seedling with her family around her. Imperfect, arrived at sideways, built from broken pieces and stubbornness, and the accumulated weight of 8 months of showing up and choosing to stay. And she thought about what it meant to belong somewhere. She had thought, for most of her life, that belonging was something that happened to you, that you were born into it or you weren't, and if you weren't, you spent your time in other people's spaces trying not to take up too much room. She had been wrong about that. Belonging was not a condition. It was a practice. It was something you did every day, with your hands and your presence and your willingness to keep trying when trying was hard, until one day you looked up and you were standing in the rain in your own yard with your children around you, and the smell of your own bread in the air and a tree in the ground that would outlast all of you. That was not the version of belonging she'd been promised. It was better. It was the version that couldn't be taken away because you had built it yourself, piece by piece, from what was actually available, and it had the integrity of things made from real materials rather than easy ones. The rain settled into something lighter, more patient. Micah put his hand briefly on her shoulder, just for a second, just passing, and went inside. Eli announced that he was extremely wet and also hungry and followed his brother. Caleb looked at Evelyn across the small oak, and she looked back at him, and there was no word for what passed between them that was adequate to the thing itself, and she'd stopped looking for adequate words. Rosie put her hand in Evelyn's. They stood together in the last of the rain and looked at the tree. It was small. It would take years. Oaks were slow. But it was in the ground,